For such a smart dude, it's a really stupid idea. Honestly, it makes no sense. And the core of the answer is that everything happened far, far too fast. There was, between the death and resurrection of Christ, and when we have the whole gospel, is literally, we can prove it was maybe 3 months.
This is the Land in the Bible podcast. Welcome to the Land in the Bible podcast. I'm here with Jameson Creel. How's it going, Jameson?
Doing good.
Doing good?
It's been
I'm doing
snowing
good.
like crazy. Yeah.
But you live in Greece.
Yeah, we're doing
it's snowing
good.
in Greece?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so people don't know this about Greece, but there's big giant mountains here and ski resorts all over the country, so it's really a country you can do everything. There's you can snorkel, you can scuba dive, you can sail, but you can also go up in the mountains and snow ski and all that kind of crazy stuff. So we live on a mountain, just outside of Athens. And so, yes, we have lots of snow. It's been snowing around here.
Yeah, I know when we went and did our filming in Greece for the series on Paul, it snowed, and I was very surprised. I did not know it was supposed to do that there. I'm very excited to eventually share that content, so that'll be super cool. But today, we may get to talk about Paul a little bit. We'll see, but we're going to talk about evidence for the resurrection and some different things leading into Easter, of course. We have a series on Passion Week that is available on our website, and we've been releasing clips on various channels and different things from that series. So I kind of, to go with that, we talked a little bit about some of these things in that series where we actually went, to the Holy Land, went all around and filmed everything that happened during Passion Week. But I kind of wanted to piggyback on that and then talk about some of the common objections and then just some of the different things from an apologetic standpoint, from an archaeological standpoint about how, we can have, as Christians, have faith in the resurrection and a lot of things surrounding what was recorded about the resurrection and the early church. So I thought that would be a good thing to piggyback on all of that we already filmed.
There's been a recent book written. It was like Atheism is Dead. Because like years ago, like in the 60s, you had the famous like God is Dead thing, was published by, I think it was Time magazine, and then you have, of course, Nietzsche back in like 1890 or so saying God is dead and, the whole world can't soak up the blood that's going to, be shed, which he was right about that, by the way. As we've left God, we've killed a lot of people, in the 20th century. But it is a good time to evaluate, like, is our faith reasonable? Does it actually make sense? Or are we just all a bunch of, wishful thinkers that need a crutch that are, believing in sky fairies, basically, which is, what you hear people say, like, oh yeah, which God do you believe in, Zeus? They'll kind of say these sort of silly things. And, I think it's a good time to talk about, does it make sense? Because I have a baseline belief that God gave us lots of faculties. He gave us a mind. He gave us emotions. He gave us a spirit. Like, he gave us all these things. And I think at the end of the day, if we pursue any of them with an honest heart, and with enough courage to really follow them down the line, then they're going to lead us to God. I don't think our reason is going to lead us away from God. The world and the promoters of like a scientific worldview, materialist worldview, they want to say that we're the dummies. Yeah, however you want to. I like the term scientific because it's pointing out the fact that sort of saying that science is basically their religion. They have a faith-based belief that science can answer all the questions, which is clearly not true. I mean, there are so many questions that science cannot get me remotely close to. Science can't do anything to tell me like, how much is my relationship with my wife worth? There's just questions that it can't answer. And so like putting all your eggs in the science basket is I think clearly foolish.
Yeah, and I think this sets the stage for some of those common objections for the resurrection and evidence for it, because we're kind of starting off with that skeptical, worldview. So I'll just lob some of those out there, and then we can kind of discuss them. And then maybe you can also provide some context for maybe what was going on culturally in this time period as well, just as we start to unpack the kind of the answers, I guess, or the responses to the objections. You can kind of lay a little bit of groundwork culturally, because that's always really helpful.
And this whole topic this whole topic is definitely a topic of passion for you. So talk more than normal. Like
I will see what I can do.
For all of you out there who listen to us, Josh is really good on this topic. So he's about to slay you with his wisdom and knowledge.
now you're just setting the stage, setting the expectation too high. All right. So here's some common objections. You can kind of tell me what your thoughts are on these. We can kind of talk through some of the standard responses to these. But so one, the resurrection was a legend that developed over time. Another one, the burial story was invented, or it could not have happened the way they say it happened. And then we've got the resurrection story was invented based off of like other dying god stories. So maybe you could talk a little bit about.
So let's go with number 2 first.
All right.
If it's okay.
There's two more, which is the disciples were just hallucinating or having subjective visions. Okay. Yeah. Or it was just cognitive dissonance. So those are 5. Okay. There's a lot more. I think some of those are kind of weird, but
So I'll start with the first one, but not answer the question, because I think that's going to be our whole next episode. Maybe is the first one, because you're basically, the first one was sort of that there was like a legend building process. This opinion has, I think, become much more popular in recent years. For instance, I was listening to a Rogan podcast. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not, but I was. And
everyone does it. It's fine.
Yeah. So I was listening, and he had Jordan Peterson on, and this was the perspective that Jordan Peterson was articulating. So that's a pretty popular intellectual, whether you love him or hate him. Like, he gets a lot of views. And he said that, like, writing Jesus stories was like writing Batman. Like, you sort of establish a central character and kind of how he acts, and then you could have all kinds of different authors that could write, the genre. And for such a smart dude, it's a really stupid idea. Like, honestly, it makes no sense. And the core of the answer is that everything happened far, far too fast. There was, between the death and resurrection of Christ, and when we have the whole gospel, death, deity, resurrection of Christ being articulated, is literally, we can prove it was maybe 3 months. Okay. So that's probably going to be our whole teaser. We'll probably break all that down. There's a great Christian intellectual guy named Gary Habermas that's done a lot of work on this. So our next episode will definitely borrow from him some, and then add some other stuff regarding Paul that becomes sort of clear here in Greece, that you can sort of add some archaeological proof to his general thesis, is kind of where we'll go with that. But just know that the legend building thesis idea, it just simply doesn't hold any water. There wasn't enough time. The writers weren't good enough. Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're laymen, they're fishermen, Luke's a doctor, so he's a little more qualified, but there's no Shakespeare in the group,
Right.
And I'm going a little bit down the road, but the short stories Jesus tells are possibly the most influential things ever uttered by a human. You got things like the Good Samaritan story. It's about 10 or 12 sentences long, maybe. I don't know. It's not very long. And it's changed the world. I mean, I mean, I'm sitting here in Greece working with refugees, right? Well, about 7 years ago or so, when the war in Syria was full on, you just going nuts. Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, threw the doors open and said they can come here. And she did that in large part because she grew up in a pastor's home and she knew the Good Samaritan story. And she's like, this is what we're supposed to do. So you have the mass movement of millions of people influenced by a short story that a guy told 2,000 years ago. How do you really fake that? That's hard. I mean, and some of the stories are so like, they're really like 4-6 sentences long, full of deep truth.
Mm-hmm.
That
Well,
changes
yeah, and
people.
we went over that story in our parable series, and even just the cultural context of that story alone is so radical for the time period.
Yeah. And so like and to think that like these four guys were all just sort of making it up as they went along, and they all told stories that make sense, and they all told stories that were radical and amazing and world changing. And again, you're talking like stories that are sometimes 4, 6, 8 sentences long that are world changing, and like every sentence is laden with truth. How do you get a fisherman to write like that? So there's a ton of problems with that theory that just everybody was writing them. They just picked the ones they liked. Well, first off, there's no evidence for it, like none. But then secondly, it doesn't hold up. And the main reason hold up is the timeline. So that's gonna be next episode. So we're not gonna go down that path tonight. I'm fighting with myself to not go there. But just know, you got to know, no, it was not legend writing over hundreds of years. The whole thing was fully formed immediately. 100%.
I've wanted to mention this book, and maybe this is a good time to mention it, because I do hear a lot of times a common objection is like, for people that really haven't dug into Christianity and wrestled with some of these things, is that with the historicity of the text is like, yeah, I mean, it was just stories that just developed over time, and they just wrote them down, and it was changed, and things were changed, and things were added, and they're not really considering the timeline or when they were written, or even the other things that we're going to talk about later, which is like, once you start including Paul into this and you start talking about the creeds, it starts forcing everything into a much tighter timeline, which I know we're going to talk about that later. But this is another thing I've found like amazing. This book right here, Hidden in Plain View. It's really interesting because it's, the subtitle is Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And basically what it does is it goes through the Gospels and it goes through Acts in painstaking process, honestly, and dissects like all these little things that are overlapped in the Gospels, but they're not exactly the same. So it would be like these little details that are like, well, why is this even in there? And it's in there because they're writing down a piece of the actual story, and then it gets corroborated by something you would just blow by in another gospel. And the good example that's in here that I was just going to point out is like this example from Matthew 14, where Herod Herod is talking to his servants, and he's stressed out because he's afraid that when he had John beheaded, that John has been raised from the dead. So they're talking about, he's like, he's hearing of all the stuff that Jesus is doing. He's like, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. And it's this internal conversation with Herod and his servants. And you're like, as a skeptic, when I read that stuff, as I was coming into the faith, there were little things like that throughout. And you're like, how do they know what Herod is saying? It sounds like someone just made that up. But then if you go over, this is from her book. So like if you go over to Luke 8, you find out that who's walking around with Jesus. And it's written in Luke 8. They're just saying who's walking around with him while he's doing things. And it's Mary, called Magdalene, Joanna, wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager. And then it says, and Susanna and many others. So then you find out in Luke, through this little detail, because Luke's just recording what happened, that Herod's household manager's wife is like hanging out with Mary Magdalene and following Jesus around with the 12 disciples. So like in the inner circle. And so like, I think there's little things like, okay, so you're telling me that is a legend. These things got written down years and years later, and
Yeah,
then they just developed.
And maybe a side comment in Mark confirms again sort of a side comment in Luke or John, and you have this interconnection that it's hard to figure out how that would go down. Yeah, and there's so many other things sort of like that. One I was thinking about, this gets sort of like back to the geography is proof, which is one we really like around here, which is the little tidbit in the Zacchaeus story that he climbed a sycamore tree. I mean, why did it label the tree? It didn't have to label the tree. It just said he climbed a tree, and we all been like, okay, but it said sycamore, and he's in Jericho. And then you study the geography of the Holy Land, and you find out, because the Holy Land has it's really, really mountainous, and so and it has real strong rain shadow effect. So there's some parts that actually get quite a bit of rain, some parts that get virtually none at all, and you've got from high to low, up to 10,000 feet down to 1,400 below at the Dead Sea. And so because of that, you have this little tiny country that has almost all the climactic zones. You can literally grow anything in Israel. You can grow a mango, you can grow an apple, you can grow wheat, you can grow anything there because you can just pick the elevation and how far north you want to be and south, and you can grow it. So it's really cool. Well, on the whole, sycamore trees, come to find out, like heat and water. Well, that's a problem because in Israel, heat and water don't go together. Cold and water go together. The places that are colder get more rain. The places that are hot don't get rain. And so in the whole country, you could put about 3 dots on a map, and you could be, one could grow there. Sycamore tree could go there. Okay, well, I'll give you that one too. About 3 spots. Because it's in the desert, it's down low, it's real hot, but there's a lot of groundwater, there's strong springs, and then therefore a sycamore tree can grow. Well, guess what one of those spots is? Jericho. And this is why the whole thing of like people changed it later holds no water for me. Because, somebody 300 or 400 years later in Constantinople or wherever you think they were, just could not have gotten that stuff right. They could not possibly have done it. There's no way they would have known all the geography so intimately that they could throw around little details here and there and get it right. You're also familiar with the name study, right?
Right. Yeah. The name study of the people, the amount of names, the percentage of names used in the text, in the Gospels, and then how it relates to the ossuaries that they found.
Yeah, so basically some guys a few years back got their PhD by doing this study, and how it kind of goes is there's really good records in Israel from the Second Temple period, time of Christ, let's say. And so what they did was they dug around and they got all these ossuaries which have the names carved in them, because they bury you for a year in a tomb and let you rot. And once you're just bones, they put you in a box. Then they reuse the tombs because the whole country's stone. It's limestone. It's hard to dig. And so you reuse tombs. And you kind of put, grandma in a little shoebox over in the corner, just as big as her femur, and reuse the tomb. And then you kind of stack them up. And so you'd have a whole family stacked up in a corner somewhere, which is probably what the Bible is referring to when it talks about being gathered to your fathers, that your fathers, you end up in the same pile of bones with them, at some point. But anyway, they went through that. They also went through documents they could find. They could find a name, and they just counted them. Okay, there's Mary. There's Joseph. There's Peter. There's Simon. Like they just counted the use of names, and what they discovered was that first century Jews were very, very not creative with names. And it was some crazy number. It's about 60-70% of the people had about 8 names. There were tons of Yeshuas like Jesus, tons of Simons, tons of Miriams. There was a Mary on every street corner, basically just tons of Marys. And they got a ratio. And then what they do is they just counted all the names in the New Testament. And lo and behold, the ratios are exactly the same. If 30% of the people were married, then 30% of the females in the story were married. If 20% were Simon, 20% of the males were Simon in the story. It's exactly lined up. And you're like, oh, come on, who cares? But, honestly, if I asked you right now, write a novel about 12th century Scotland, would you really get the names right? Would you really know like what people were naming their boys and girls in Scotland, 800 years ago? I guess you probably wouldn't,
Not without Google.
Even with Google, it would be tough. I don't even know. I mean, I know Google knows everything, but you use Chat GPT. Write me a novel set in Scotland based on whatever. But no, I just don't. It's not plausible that would be right. And what's even more interesting is that all the people who had super common names like Miriam, Yeshua, Simon, all of those people have titles. Okay, you can't just be Simon because there's 8 other Simons in the room. You have to be Simon the Tanner, Simon the Sorcerer, Simon called Peter. You have to have a Simon Barjona, this, and it goes on. All the Simons get a different name because you have to know which Simon we're talking about because there's too many of them. Even Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, of Nazareth.
Because his name was quite common. Mary, all the Marys, Mary the mother, Mary Magdalene. Mary. You get a tag with them because you had to distinguish between all the Marys and Simons and Joshua's running around. So who could get that right later, changing things? Yeah, to me it's utterly unbelievable. So I trust the text a lot. And there's no way it was a legend writing practice like like writing Marvel comics or something over time.
Yeah. Well, so that's good. I feel like that does cover number one. But moving on from that one, we have the burial story. So I know what you're going to talk about in this one because we actually touched on the bone boxes and this specific archaeological finding about the burial story being invented. It could not have happened because they didn't let you take the bodies down, or he was too poor to have a tomb. And yeah, the Bible does record it was a tomb of a rich man. So tell me why that one is a bogus claim.
Yeah, so there was one of the standard attacks on the gospel narrative was that Romans always buried the victims of crucifixion in mass tombs that are mass burials. That a part of the punishment was you didn't get a real burial; you got dumped in a ditch, and frankly, that was normative. They did very typically just dump the bodies of people who had been executed, somewhere not very nice as a part of the punishment because, people want to be buried properly and families want, their people buried properly. And so it was a bit of a tough one for us because, what's your answer? Well, that was until just a few years ago when, somebody's digging around near Jerusalem. And they found in a very nice tomb, in a very nice ossuary, or a expensive one, it was, finally carved, a foot bone with a nail through it. And the reason that this foot bone had the nail stuck in it is because, and you can go to the Israel Museum and see it. Like I've seen it with my own eyeballs, so that the heel is pierced with the nail. And it seems that the nail hit like a knot in the wood and bent. And so when they tried to pull the nail out, it wouldn't come. It actually hung in the foot. And so the family had to decide what to do, whether to further mangle the foot by trying to, and what they actually chose to do was to just sort of take the foot and the nail in one piece, basically. So this guy was buried with the nail in the foot bone, and it was left that way. And so we found it, and what that obviously concludes for us, you can't argue anymore, was that if you had some money, you could pay, bribe the right person, and you could get the body of your child or your teacher. So the Bible clearly states that Joseph Arimathea, who was a rich man, he's a member of the Sanhedrin, so he's one of the top 20 or 30 people in the whole country in power and probably wealth. that he went and asked for the body of Christ. And I guess because his position was able to get it. And that's consistent with the archaeological record, that people who had money and power could do those things. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, that was his, sort of moment of declaring his faith openly, because I think he'd been a secret believer at that point, following Jesus, knowing who he was, believing in him. But because of his position of power and wealth, I think he's kind of doing it on the down low, if you would. But at this point, for whatever reason, he feels like the Holy Spirit wants him to get the body, and so he does what he's supposed to do. Thank God for it, because it gives us archaeological record. So that's kind of what went down. But what the Bible says and what the archaeological record tells us is exactly consistent. So, and if you want to go further down the archaeological record, I mean, we could plunk a whole litany of these things. There was one of the things that people hated, or people that would take pot shots at. We did an episode on this, but it's worth restating if people haven't seen it. It was the fact that a lot of people said that Pontius Pilate never existed. Like this was an important province. It was, there was like war happening, conflict, and it mattered. And the Romans kept good records. And since we don't have any record that says Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea, then that proves the Bible was just kind of bull and just made up. And that held for a while. And then, Israel got to digging around Caesarea, and lo and behold, they find a rock. And that rock says, this building was built by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, during the reign of Tiberius. Like it exactly says the who and the when, and the where. There's no question. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, reign of Tiberius. So done. Since then, we have corroborating evidence, which they found also his signet ring. So found at Herodian. So
he was up there hanging out at Herod's palace, just kind of where all the bad guys hung out, and he lost clearly his ring.
Well, I mean, there's something to that, right? The Bible talks about how Herod, and this is not Herod, there's multiple Herods, right? But Herod, maybe Antipas, the one that's alive when Jesus is crucified, one of the Herods, the one that's alive, not Herod the Great, he's long dead by then. But it talks about him and Pontius Pilate, and it says that, the Bible says basically, they were never friends, but they made friends to kill Jesus. They were friends the rest of their lives because they cooperated on killing Jesus. And I always read that and think, man, scummy people, people that don't like each other will make friends to kill you, to attack you, because that's what we do. Humans are bad. So,
yeah. And I know, and we've talked about that. We did a little short on that on the podcast, but to piggyback on that, another person was Caiaphas, because of was it the ossuary?
Exactly right.
And it all fit into the historical context of
right time, right place.
Yep, of a rich man, wealthy,
Yeah, so we've got Caiaphas' bone box, so the high priest is in place. Undeniably, we've got Pontius Pilate's this inscription stone and the signet ring. His identity is in place. Undeniably, the methodology of the crucifixion and how it was done at that time is consistent with what the Bible says. And so that then leads to a question, which is, why would people making up a lie work so hard to tell the truth? So like all these people, they're like, no, they were just saying something crazy because they wanted to start a new religion or do something weird, or like whatever. Like, if they were crazy people telling a fake story, you think it'd be fake more often, but it's not. It's never.
You would definitely be embellishing the facts more. To one, I mean, if you're the founders of this new religion that you're making up, you would at least edit out all the parts in the story where you look like an idiot.
Absolutely.
And you do the wrong thing, and the disciples
and there's
are
tons of that, right?
Clueless. Yeah.
You got, Thomas saying, I won't believe till I touch him. You got Peter denying. You got one of the disciples running off naked because the soldiers kind of grab his clothes. He shakes out of him and runs off. You got them all huddled together in fear, and until Jesus shows up, they're scared of the Romans, and the temple priests are going to come get them. You got so many embarrassing details And another one that I kind of like, and you could take this or leave it, but I always chuckle because you got to know that Peter's the leader. I think clearly Peter is the leader of the disciples during the 3 years Jesus on earth. I mean, Jesus is their boss, but amongst themselves, he's the spokesman, if you would. And John refers to himself as the one Jesus loved. So it feels like there's like a little bit of sibling rivalry there, And when you read John's account, he takes little digs at Peter pretty often. And they're not bad. They're just like little, yeah, when we ran to the tomb, I got there first.
I was going to mention that. And he's like, and he outran the other one.
Yeah.
It's just so funny.
It's just like, it's a thing that you would say about your brother, somebody you love, but you had a little bit of a rivalry with, it's a little detail. And at Peter's reconciliation with Christ, he mentions that like, yeah, Peter swam to shore and the other disciples had to get the boat in, and there's almost like an eye roll in the sentence, and there's just like these little human details that, yeah, they don't make sense in a conspiracy. They just don't, it's not how you would write it. I don't believe it at all. So yeah, for sure. So, the idea that you couldn't have buried Jesus, the idea that we got the details wrong in the text are just simply wrong. So, okay. So now you've got a credible text and lots of details are accurate. So what else are they throwing at us? What are their other, what about this? What's next?
Yeah, well, there's a ton. So, I mean, and even to piggyback on some of the other things about the text, I mean, some of these are like the classic responses, which is the women find him at the tomb.
Absolutely.
Which is
you would never do
that would not be in the story. So there's that one. He's seen by large crowds. Luke references lots of people seeing
500
him.
People.
There's we talked about the not enough time. I think that's probably all I've got on my list as far. I mean,
some of these theories that are silly. You've got, like that Jesus resuscitated, that he was like almost.
He wasn't really dead.
Yeah, he was almost, but not quite dead. Well, study the Romans. The Romans were spectacularly efficient killers. They knew dead from not dead, and they knew how to kill you real good. You're thoroughly full dead. They knew what they were doing. And, you've got a man beaten, God knows how much blood loss there was, just from the scourging, then he's nailed up, on a cross where, again, not necessarily, you don't necessarily bleed a lot on a cross, there's some bleeding going on, but also you're just exhausting yourself because you're having to like pick yourself up and down to breathe, and so there's just this utter loss of blood, exhaustion, and he dies. But then to verify it, they shove a spear through his rib cage into his heart and lungs. Like he's dead. He's real fully dead. So the idea again of and also it doesn't make any sense even that you would be almost dead from that kind of treatment. And that you would come so fully, you would, a day and a half later, you'd come to in a cold tomb, get yourself out of there somehow. And that you would be, vital, vivacious, alive enough that people would be like, wow, he was right. Like, you would be messed up. You would be messed up, even if you did live, which is utterly impossible. Even if you did. Some miracle, the spear went just like curved around your heart and just, caused some bleeding and whatever dumb thing you wanted to say happened. You're going to be so incapacitated. Your recovery is going to take years if ever it happens. Like you would probably be just, crippled for life. So it doesn't make sense that he showed up and was speaking and walking and talking and people like, whoa, he's alive. The whole reaction is inconsistent with that. So to me, there's absolutely no way that's possible. I guess another one is the hallucination.
Yeah, the
Hypothesis.
next two I have is the resurrection story was invented based off of other, myths and, kind of paralleling.
We'll back up to that one next.
Well, we'll do that one, but then also the disciples were experiencing hallucinations or subjective visions. Like people will say this, they'll say, skeptics might say, well, they've known people that have seen a vision of their dead relative after they die. They'll be sitting there and they'll like see the person who died. And then they'll fade away. And it's just like, maybe that's what happened. It was just his spirit or something like that. That's not what the Gospels record, but that everyone had that.
Touching things, cooking things. So no. And yeah, and then you get to the idea that like, can you really have a joint hallucination? Like I understand that individuals can have hallucinations, but the idea that like you and I are going to simultaneously have the same hallucination that's going to motivate us to act in a certain way, it seems a little difficult to me.
Or I know they call it like a grief vision. I think people call it that as well.
Yeah, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't hold up to the time. Again, if you're going to accept the text, and I do accept the text because there's too many things about that are good, then he appeared multiple times to different people over the course of weeks. So even if you want to say that you had some like emotionally wrought moment where you were so grieved and so whatever that you made yourself believe this thing or had this vision. Okay, let's say that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I guess you have things like the Jim Jones thing back in the 70s or whatever, where 1,500 people literally drank the Kool-Aid. Other people are drinking it and dying. You're like, well, let's go, and you drink it too, knowing it's cyanide. So you do have times when people sort of have a mass psychosis where they're like their brains all do the weird, same manipulated bad thing at the same time. But I don't know about a mass hallucination that we're all seeing something in our own heads and we all see the same thing. That one doesn't hold. That's where it doesn't hold weight for me. I believe that you can be so grieved that you make yourself believe something. It's so emotional. That you can be manipulated. Sure. But it's too many people. There's not a dissent voiced, and we've got too many. Again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Also Paul's writing and Peter's writing. We have lots of witnesses saying this is what happened. We saw him. Again, and in very physical things. We ate with him. It'd be hard to imagine how you had a hallucination of someone, cooking food for you, which is what Peter does for the disciples on the shore of the Galilee. Where'd the fish come from then?
Or what Jesus does.
Yeah. So it doesn't make sense. Like, could you have some one-off event somewhere? Yeah, I guess possibly. I can't say it's not possible at all. I think it's unlikely, even that. But to consistently have hundreds of people have the same hallucination. And the other issue is that if that was the case, it would be very disprovable, right? Because you have this guarded tomb, and the people that hated Jesus, the temple scribes, Pharisee types, all they had to do was like go grab a body, like when all the people were like, "It's Jesus, he's resurrected, he's alive. Woo. Just go get the body, display it. Look, here's the dead body." And it all ends that day, but they didn't. Well, so then you have to say, well, they stole it, because even if there was a mass hysteria of some sort, the reason that the sane people who knew what was up didn't just produce a body and stop it all is because they couldn't. So then you have to say, well, the crazy people who believed he was resurrected also stole the body, which that doesn't make any sense at all. You don't steal a body that you think is resurrected, So you have to put together two conspiracies that don't make sense together. So somehow they stole the body and then spazzed out, and thought he was resurrected. I mean, I don't even know how it works.
And then made up all the stories, and then that perfectly fit in with each other, and yet made themselves look bad. Died for what they believed, even if they hallucinated it. They died for that.
Yeah,
later.
absolutely. And we'll delve more into this in the next episode. But at the end of the day, the existence of the church born in Jerusalem is probably the best apologetic, because it's the last place a church should be born. Like, first off, no Jew was anticipating a suffering Messiah. You know, when they read the Messiah text in like Isaiah and places like that, they read the whole text. And so where Jesus talks about, declaring the day of the Lord's favor or something like that, well, they read the rest of Isaiah where it'd say, and his wrath, and you'll sit in a house you didn't build, and the nations will serve you food, and that there's going to be this reckoning, this justice, and these Greeks and Romans who are awful and terrible and pagan, and demonic and immoral. The Messiah is going to show up. He's going to fix all that and put us back on top. We're going to be the bosses, not the Romans. That's what they believed in. They didn't believe that he would show up, complete the first half of the mission, go back to heaven for a while, come back, complete the second half. None of them believed that. None of them wanted that. At the ascension, they're like, kingdom now? Now's the kingdom time? And Jesus is like, not yet, later.
Like, so he's literally about to go up, and they're like,
he's
wait.
At the ascension. Yeah, well, you're not done. You're not done yet. And he's like, well, for now I am. See you in a bit, That's not what they wanted. They certainly weren't expecting a crucified resurrected Messiah, who was the embodiment of God. And I would argue that there is evidence for it in the Old Testament, that there are statements in places like Daniel or whatever that clearly let us know, now looking back at it retrospectively, that you were going to have an embodiment of God, of Yahweh. But they weren't expecting that. They weren't seeing that in the text at the time. So Jesus is the last thing the last story you would expect those people to tell. Jews don't tell stories about an embodied God. Romans tell stories about an embodied God. But they talk about Zeus and Apollo coming down and having sex with women and all. Yeah, that's Greeks and Romans do that. Jews don't do that at all. So it's the wrong story. It doesn't make sense they would tell it, but they tell it and they believe it so much that they're willing to die. Above and beyond that, the church is born in Jerusalem. The easiest place to disprove the death and resurrection of Christ would have been in Jerusalem if he was in the ground somewhere. But he wasn't, So the fact that the church was born from the most unlikely of people in the most unlikely place, and historically, it's just true. You cannot get around the fact that Christianity exists, that it was birthed, in the decades following the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. You cannot escape it. And so, yeah,
what the church became is what Jesus said it was going to happen.
Oh, they would go into all the world, preach the gospel, teaching, the sort of the Great Commission, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And who could anticipate that? There had never been a sort of like a all religions at that point were national. Even God was the God of Israel, of a nation. Zeus is the god of Greeks. Osiris, the god of Egypt, very clearly stated. They had territorial gods. You got a story in the Old Testament where this Syrian guy comes and he's healed by Elisha, I think. And, Naaman, we usually say in English. And in the end, he takes back dirt from Israel because he wants to worship his God. He wants to worship God. But in Syria, he's like, I can't worship God in Syria. He doesn't do his thing over there. Over there, I don't know who the Syrians were worshiping, frankly, Syrians. I don't know who their God was. But he's like, yeah, this other guy's strong over there. On his Baal or something, maybe, who knows. And so he took some earth and, spread it around his room in his house and put a shrine to Yahweh up so that he could worship. He was best. The guy was doing the best he could, what he knew, but he thought he had to have earth from Israel to worship God on, every god back then, every god was national. And the Jews, or I'm sorry, Christianity comes along and it's like, no, it's universal. Famously, maybe we'll do something about Paul and human rights later, but Paul famously says, before God, there is no, male or female, slave or free, Jew or Greek, right? So gender doesn't matter, class doesn't matter, race doesn't matter. He says, because these things don't exist in Christ Jesus. Okay. So what he's doing is creating a different identity now. That when you take on the identity of I'm a Jesus person, I'm now in Christ Jesus, then your value as a human, at that point, you're in God's family and he loves a slave girl as much as he loves the emperor, irrespective of all these things. And of course, that's a utterly, utterly bizarre thing to say. But to get back to the point of universalism, Paul is saying anyone of any level in society, any race, whatever, you come in, you're one in Christ. You can pray to him from anywhere, from Indonesia, you know about that yet, India, Spain, wherever you are, you can pray to the same God. He'll hear you. He loves you the same. It's, he's no afraid of persons. Nobody had even thought of that yet. That you could have like this multinational community of people based on a belief in a God that wasn't national. I mean, it's all so far outside of everything that was being done that it kind of just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, but it happened. So the best way to explain why it happened, why these guys were willing to die for what they believed they saw and heard, is that it did happen. To me, that's just what you're left with. It did happen. Now, what we'll get into, I think, in a couple of coming episodes, certainly, one more regarding the resurrection, is we'll talk about timeline issues, because the timeline, this gets back to the textual criticism. Can you trust the text was original, accurate, and dated at the right time? So it gets back into that, but it gets into it, and we're going to get some real gritty detail about that and how we can really prove, exactly when Paul was in certain places, exactly when he wrote certain letters, and we can prove that the full gospel was articulated very, very early, which doesn't allow for the, legend building. So we'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll piggyback on that because I wanted to mention this. I believe this is in Dominion, this one line that just like hit me in the face. But it kind of goes to what the book Dominion by Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, Tom Holland. But
he's one of my favorite thinkers in the world.
Yeah.
If you don't know Tom Holland, find his videos. He's so good.
It's
such an interesting. I hope he sends me some money.
It's such an interesting book. That
we'll
just
go
kind
on
of
your podcast.
Sorry. Yeah, it's such an interesting book. It just kind of like meanders through church history. He just almost like he's just doing this through church history and just taking you wherever his brain leads, but it kind of weaves it all together into an interesting narrative that is easy to follow. But
in the end is great. It's a tough slog. The last 100 pages are so worth it.
It's very thick, so I'm not through it all yet. But so
the last 100 pages are great.
So this is one of the things that he says. So to your point where you were talking about
the wrong story.
Well, the fact that we can date things Paul wrote and where he was when he wrote them, like, when he wrote the creeds, or when he wrote down the creed, that, the things that I've taught you. And first, we'll go into it next time. But so that's actually the fact that, they had this, that they had I guess that you call it like a high Christology. They had a high Christology early. The skeptics will say they had a low Christology, and that Christ as Jesus as God was developed later. And this kind of thinking proves that they had a high Christology early on. So, but what Tom says, I believe this is in his book, maybe you remember it. He says that when Paul was writing his letters, that those came first, which we know, right? That those are early. But then what happened was the church. So, the church needed the sayings of Jesus and his life to be written down. So his teachings had to be written down. It makes sense that Paul, if a movement is forming and people are believing, what does he do? He goes around, he's creating disciples, he's writing theology. This is what you should be doing. This is what the Old Testament meant. This is what you should believe. This is how you should live.
And Paul's letters in some ways to me are almost like military correspondence. They're like letters from the field,
Right.
So he's in Ephesus working, but he's shooting letters back to Corinth, correcting problems or whatever. So they're almost like, again, the correspondence from the field in a way. So that's why Paul doesn't write long books, like Luke or Matthew, is that's not what he's doing. He's just doing church growth in real time, and thank God we have the record of it, right? So his writing's totally different than the gospel. It's not even the same genre.
And I guess my point is, if when we make a case for Paul, we can say about the creeds, we're going to talk about that next week and talk about what he was writing and the time periods and where he was. But then the fact that off this, this little thing from Dominion, he just kind of throws it as like a throwaway line of like, Paul did this. And then of course, after, a generation of people growing into their faith, and they weren't around when Jesus was teaching, they're like, wait a second, we have to take these teachings, this belief, and then whatever they had, and they're like, okay, we need to go back. And so then, Mark gets it from Peter, and then Luke does his thing, and it's like, okay, this actually makes way more sense as to why.
Well, and if you think about it, it just makes perfectly good sense that the first years after the death, resurrection of Christ, that these guys were all busy just growing the church. They're preaching and teaching and, managing a church and doing whatever you do. But near the end of their life, 20, 30 years down the road, they're thinking like, I got to get this down. I think maybe some of them, because it's clear from Paul that some of them really thought the return of Christ was very imminent. Like, I think some of them thought early on, maybe I don't need to write this stuff because, they thought maybe Jesus was going to be back in a weekend, a year or two. And then at some point it's like, oh, okay. Well, and Paul answers this. He talks about, the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we who are alive. He says, we who are alive, are going to go meet Jesus in the air. So he's still thinking that maybe he's going to be alive when Jesus shows up, So they didn't really understand the patience of God, I don't think, and how he wanted the gospel to really penetrate the whole world. It says it, but I don't think that they had their heads wrapped around it,
Well, yeah, and their view of the whole world was different.
Yeah, it didn't include the Philippines, like the Americas, So absolutely, yeah, it was too far, but it makes sense that they would be writing late in life when they realize, oh, I'm going to die, and this can't die with me, so let's get it down now. And depending on, John was the youngest, Peter was the oldest, therefore it makes sense that Mark was probably written first, which is what the records basically show. Mark probably written like 50, 60, something like that. So only 20 to 30 years after. You can remember, if you lived through something truly earth-shattering, you can remember enough details 20, 30 years later to write the book. Like that's not a problem. And people write their memoirs late in life all the time. We don't question Winston Churchill or U.S. Grant's memoirs that he wrote late in life. They're like, well, by the time he died, it'd been 20 years since, Gettysburg. Yeah, he can't remember that. Well, of course he remembered it. Of course he remembered it and recounted it accurately. Grant wasn't at Gettysburg, but you get the point. Pick another battle in the Civil War.
Well, and like they said that at least for Luke, that he interviewed eyewitnesses. I mean, it makes sense that there was an oral tradition of some kind that they're like, sure. Well, this is what they were passing.
Yeah, but I want to be careful with the term oral tradition, because that makes it feel like again, like it was the sort of game of telephone where things get skewed. It was eyewitnesses still,
right?
They were people who could falsify these things. They could say, "No, Luke, it didn't happen like that."
Right. Well, I guess when I'm saying oral tradition, I mean an oral culture. And that if they're saying this is what was said and it wasn't written down, then
yeah, these are the stories being shared in the church.
Right. So, and I guess this is kind of what Tom was saying is it makes sense of when they chose to write the Gospels, because the people that are, as it's aging, maybe the people who are around, you have people who are coming into the church who weren't around.
So, Mark is telling Peter, let's get the story down. All right, you talk, or something like that. Makes sense. Another thing that Paul says that I think gets back to this like unlikely story thesis is he talks about the gospel and he says it's a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Greeks. He's like, man, this gospel, I believe it, but it's a tough sell. It's just, Jews are like, no, you can't have the Messiah dead on a crucified and, incarnate God. So stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Romans. Because to Romans were all will to power. Their heroes were Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, people who like, Leonidas of Sparta. They were all these people that like fought and took a position and like, they were completely godless and not Christian. They didn't believe in humility and dying on a cross to save other people. They believed in like taking up your sword and smiting the weak to defend to take what was yours, So you start talking about like, yeah, he was God. He let himself get crucified to pay for our sins. And Greeks and Romans were like, that's stupid. It was foolishness to them, but it was true, So again, it's the wrong story. Nobody wants to tell that story, but that's the story they told.
Well, cool. Well, that was definitely a good episode for a kickoff of Evidence for the Resurrection. So we'll get into a little bit more of that next week. We'll talk about Paul. We'll talk about the creeds. We'll talk about lots of cool stuff and the dates. And, maybe we can get into some manuscript stuff too, if we have time. But all in all, I think this is going to be fun. I enjoy talking about this stuff. I find it super interesting, and I appreciate you shedding some wisdom and light on all of these things.
We do our best.
Cool. Well, as always, if you're enjoying this, you can go subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can go to our website and subscribe over there for premium content, where we actually go and travel to all these places that we're talking about and see these things firsthand. But however you're going to do it, we just appreciate your support, and also listen to the podcast everywhere it's streaming, and we will see you later.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandofthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.